cold does not kill people. Wind kills people. This is the distinction that separates the survivors from the dead in every extreme winter environment on Earth. And it is the distinction that most people, including most people who live in cold climates, fail to understand until the wind teaches them. A human body can survive sustained exposure to temperatures of 20 below 0 Fahrenheit if the air is still. The body generates heat through metabolism. The clothing traps that heat against the skin, and the still air between the clothing layers acts as insulation that slows the rate of heat loss to a level the body can sustain for hours. But add wind, 30 miles per hour of wind at 20 below 0, and the effective temperature drops to 60 below. The wind strips heat from the body's surface faster than metabolism can replace it. The clothing, designed to trap still air, is penetrated by moving air that carries the trapped warmth away in seconds. Exposed skin freezes in minutes. Core body temperature begins to drop within an hour. Death follows within 3 to 4 hours if shelter is not found. What wind does to a human body, it does to a building. A cabin in still air at 20 below 0 loses heat through conduction. The heat inside the cabin passes slowly through the walls, the roof, the floor, and the windows to the cold air outside. The rate of heat loss through conduction is steady and predictable, determined by the thickness and thermal resistance of the building materials, and a well-built cabin with thick log walls and a good stove can maintain a comfortable interior temperature indefinitely in still cold air by burning a moderate amount of fuel. But add wind and everything changes. Wind creates convective heat loss, moving air scrubbing across the exterior surface of the walls and roof, stripping heat from the building envelope 10 to 20 times faster than still air. Wind finds every gap, every crack, every loose chink, every poorly sealed joint in the building, and drives cold air through those openings into the interior, replacing the warm air that the stove has heated. Wind creates pressure differentials, positive pressure on the windward side that forces cold air in, negative pressure on the leeward side that sucks warm air out, turning the cabin into a wind tunnel that the stove cannot overcome. A cabin that burns 3 cords of wood per winter in still air might burn 6 or 8 cords in a windy location and still be cold because the wind is removing heat faster than the fire can produce it. And then there is the structural dimension. Wind exerts force on every surface it contacts. A 30-mile-per-hour wind exerts approximately 2 pounds of pressure per square foot on a vertical surface. A 60-mile-per-hour wind, common in the severe blizzards that strike Alaska, the northern plains, and the mountain passes of the Western Territories, exerts approximately 8 pounds per square foot. The windward wall of a typical cabin, measuring 20 feet wide and 8 feet tall, presents 160 square feet of surface to the wind. At 8 pounds per square foot, the total wind force on that wall is approximately 1,280 pounds, more than half a ton of lateral force pushing against the wall, trying to push it off its foundation, trying to peel the roof off the rafters, trying to collapse the structure. A well-built log cabin can resist this force. A hastily built frame cabin, a canvas tent, a sod structure with weak roof timbers, these cannot. In the great blizzards, buildings did not merely get cold, they came apart. In the interior of Alaska Territory in the winter of 1898, all of these forces converged. The Yukon River Valley, where the gold rush had drawn thousands of prospectors and settlers over the previous 2 years, was one of the most extreme winter environments inhabited by non-indigenous people anywhere on the continent. Winter temperatures routinely reached 30 to 40 below zero. The wind, channeled by the river valley and the surrounding mountains, blew at sustained speeds of 20 to 40 miles per hour during storms, with gusts exceeding 60. The storms came without warning. A clear morning at 15 below could become a whiteout blizzard at 40 below with 50-mile-per-hour winds by afternoon, and the blizzard could last 3 days. The snow was not the soft, wet snow of the coastal ranges. It was dry, fine, crystalline, driven by the wind into every crack and gap in every structure, piling into drifts 20 feet deep on the leeward side of any obstacle, scouring exposed surfaces like sandpaper. The buildings that the gold rush settlers had constructed were, for the most part, inadequate for these conditions. Most were log cabins built hastily from green spruce timber, the trees cut, the logs notched and stacked, the gaps chinked with moss and mud, the roofs covered with poles and sod or canvas. The construction was fast. A cabin could go up in a week, but the quality was poor. Green logs shrank as they dried, opening gaps in the walls that let wind and snow penetrate. The chinking dried and cracked and fell out. The roofs, supported by undersized ridge poles and rafters, sagged under the weight of accumulating snow and were vulnerable to wind uplift during storms. The foundations were shallow, logs laid on the frozen ground surface, with no excavation, no drainage, and no anchor against lateral wind forces. Now, Yelena Morozova did not build a log cabin on the frozen ground. She built a Zemlyanka, a Russian earth-sheltered shelter that was half underground and half above ground, designed to resist everything the Alaskan winter could deliver: the cold, the wind, the snow, and the structural forces that destroyed conventional cabins in every major storm. Yelena had arrived in Alaska in the fall of 1897, traveling from Vladivostok by ship to St. Michael, and then upriver by steamboat to a settlement on the Yukon approximately 40 miles below the gold fields. She was not a prospector. She was a widow. Her husband Kolya had died of tuberculosis in Irkutsk in 1895, leaving her with a small inheritance and no prospects in a Siberian city where a woman without a husband and without family connections had few options. She had heard about the gold rush from Russian traders at Vladivostok and had made the crossing not to mine gold, but to establish a supply post, selling provisions, equipment, and labor to the prospectors who poured through the settlement on their way to the diggings. She was 41 years old, built strong and square from a childhood of physical labor on a farm near Krasnoyarsk, and she carried with her the knowledge of how to survive a Siberian winter, knowledge that was about to prove more valuable than any gold claim in Alaska. The Zemlyanka was the standard winter shelter of rural Siberia, where temperatures dropped to 50 and 60 below zero, and where the wind across the steppe and the taiga was relentless. The word means, approximately, earth house, a structure built by excavating a rectangular pit 4 to 6 feet deep, constructing log walls from the bottom of the pit upward to a height of 3 to 4 feet above ground level, and then covering the structure with a roof of poles, birch bark, and earth. The result was a shelter that was approximately half underground and half above ground, the lower portion entirely surrounded by earth, the upper portion exposed but heavily insulated with earth and sod on the roof and bermed earth against the above-ground walls. The engineering principles were simple and powerful. Earth is a thermal moderator. The ground temperature in the Yukon Valley, below the seasonal frost line at a depth of 4 to 6 feet, remains approximately 32 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cold by indoor standards, but vastly warmer than the -40-degree air above the surface. A shelter with its floor and lower walls in direct contact with 35-degree Earth starts with a 75-degree thermal advantage over a shelter sitting on the surface in 40 below air. The Earth surrounding the lower walls acts as a massive thermal battery, absorbing heat from the shelter interior during the day and releasing it back at night, moderating the temperature swings that plagued above-ground cabins where the interior temperature could drop 20 degrees in 3 hours after the fire died. Wind protection was equally critical. A shelter that is 4 feet below grade presents only 3 to 4 feet of vertical surface to the wind instead of 8 feet. The wind force on a wall 3 feet tall is less than half the force on a wall 8 feet tall, because wind speed increases with height above the ground. The air near the surface is slowed by friction with the terrain, and at ground level in rough terrain, the wind speed can be 50% lower than at 8 feet. A Zemlyanka, with most of its structure below the wind, experienced a fraction of the convective heat loss and structural stress that an above-ground cabin endured in the same storm. And then there was the snow. In an above-ground cabin, snow accumulation on the roof was a burden, weight that stressed the rafters and ridgepole that had to be shoveled off periodically to prevent collapse. In a Zemlyanka, snow accumulation was a benefit. Snow is an insulator. Fresh snow contains approximately 90% air by volume, and that trapped air gives snow a thermal resistance of approximately R1 per inch. A 2-foot snowdrift over a Zemlyanka roof added R24 of insulation, the equivalent of 6 inches of modern fiberglass, on top of whatever insulation the earth and sod already provided. The deeper the snow, the warmer the shelter. The very storm that threatened to destroy an above-ground cabin was actively insulating the Zemlyanka, burying it under a blanket of protection that grew thicker with every hour of snowfall. Yelena began construction in September of 1898, as soon as she had secured her supply post and established enough trade to fund the materials she could not source from the land. The site she chose was a south-facing slope, approximately 200 yards from the river, above the spring floodline, on ground that was well drained and that had a natural windbreak of spruce trees to the north and west. The south-facing exposure was critical. It maximized the low winter sun that reached the settlement for only 5 to 6 hours per day in December, and it meant that the entrance faced away from the prevailing north wind. The excavation took 2 weeks. Yelena and a hired laborer named Semyon, a fellow Russian who had come north for the gold rush and found more reliable income in construction work, dug a rectangular pit 18 feet long, 14 feet wide, and 4.5 feet deep into the hillside. The digging was brutal. The top 18 inches were soft, thawed topsoil and organic matter that yielded to a shovel. Below that was permafrost, permanently frozen soil that had to be broken with a pickaxe, loosened with boiling water poured from a kettle, and scooped out in frozen chunks with a flat spade. They worked 6 hours a day on the excavation, advancing approximately 6 inches of depth per day across the full floor area. And by the end of September, the pit was complete. A clean rectangular hole in the hillside with vertical walls of frozen earth that were as solid as concrete and that would remain frozen and structurally sound as long as the shelter above them kept the ground temperature below freezing at the wall surface. The log walls rose from the bottom of the pit. Yelena used spruce logs, 8 to 10 inches in diameter, cut from the surrounding forest, debarked, and notched at the corners with a saddle notch that locked each log to the ones above and below it. The walls extended from the pit floor to a height of approximately 3.5 feet above the surrounding ground level, a total wall height of 8 feet, of which 4.5 feet were below grade, surrounded by frozen earth, and 3.5 feet were above grade, exposed to the air. The below-grade logs were laid directly against the frozen earth walls of the pit, with no gap. The earth pressed against the logs on all 4 sides, providing both insulation and structural support. The above-grade logs were chinked with moss and clay in the traditional manner, but Yelena added a detail that was standard in Siberian Zemlyanka construction and that no one else in the settlement used. She bermed earth against the exterior of the above-ground walls to a height of approximately 2 feet, packing the earth tightly against the logs and sloping it away from the wall to shed water. The berming reduced the exposed above-ground wall surface from 3.5 feet to approximately 18 inches. A narrow strip of log wall between the top of the earth berm and the roofline that was the only part of the entire structure directly exposed to the wind. The roof was the most critical element. Yelena laid ridge poles and rafters of spruce, heavier timbers than the settlement standard, 8 to 10 inches in diameter instead of 5 to 6, because the roof had to support not just the sod and earth covering, but the weight of accumulated snow that she intended to allow to remain as insulation rather than shoveling off. Over the rafters, she laid a deck of split spruce poles, tight together with no gaps. Over the poles, she laid sheets of birch bark, overlapping like shingles, creating a waterproof membrane that would prevent snowmelt and rain from penetrating into the interior. Over the birch bark, she spread 6 inches of earth and sod, tamped firm, creating an insulating layer with a thermal resistance of approximately R3 to R4. The total roof assembly, rafters, poles, birch bark, earth, and the eventual snow cover was designed to provide R25 to R30 of insulation in midwinter, when 2 feet of snow lay on top of the earth. The entrance was not a simple door in the wall. Yelena built an entrance tunnel, a passage approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 5 feet tall, angled downward from the exterior grade to the interior floor level. The tunnel served as an airlock. Cold air is denser than warm air, and in a conventional cabin, the cold air rushes in every time the door is opened, displacing the warm air and dropping the interior temperature. In a Zemlyanka with a downward sloping entrance tunnel, the warm air inside the shelter, being lighter, floats above the cold air in the tunnel, and the cold air, being heavier, settles into the tunnel without rising into the living space. The tunnel trapped the cold air in a 6-foot buffer zone between the exterior and the interior, reducing the heat loss from door opening by approximately 80% compared to a conventional door. The interior was a single room, approximately 16 by 12 feet of usable floor space, with a cast iron stove at the center, a plank sleeping platform along one wall, a cooking and work area along the opposite wall, and storage shelves along the back wall. The ceiling height at the ridge was approximately 7 feet, comfortable for standing, sloping to approximately 5.5 feet at the walls. 2 small windows, each approximately 12 by 18 inches, were set into the above-ground portion of the south wall, providing light during the short winter days. The windows were double-paned, 2 layers of glass separated by an air gap, a technique Yelena had learned from the better-built houses in Irkutsk, providing twice the insulation of a single pane. The total construction cost was approximately $110, $60 in labor, Semyon's wages for 6 weeks, $20 for the cast iron stove and stovepipe, $15 for the window glass, and $15 for hardware. Hinges, door latch, iron stove brackets, and nails for the plank sleeping platform and shelving. The logs, the earth, the birch bark, the moss, and the sod were all sourced from the site at no cash cost. The settlement's reaction was predictable. Cravath, a former mining engineer from Colorado who had appointed himself the settlement's authority on construction, told Yelena that she was digging her own grave. He said it to her face, standing at the edge of the excavation while she and Semyon shoveled frozen earth. He said that a hole in the ground would fill with water in the spring, that the walls would collapse when the permafrost thawed, that the roof would cave in under the snow, and that she would suffocate from the stove fumes in an underground space with no ventilation. He said these things loudly enough for the dozen men working on their own cabins nearby to hear, and several of them laughed. Lucille Pardlow, who ran the settlement's general store with her husband, was more sympathetic, but equally skeptical. She told Yelena privately that the underground shelter might stay warm, but that it would be damp, that the earth walls would weep moisture into the interior, that the bedding would be perpetually damp, that mold would grow on every surface, and that the health consequences of living in a damp underground space would be worse than the cold she was trying to avoid. Lucille had seen sod houses on the Nebraska prairie that were damp and moldy, and she assumed that any earth-sheltered structure would have the same problems. Yelena did not argue with either of them. She had lived in a Zemlyanka in Siberia. She knew what worked. If you want to know what happened when a Russian widow dug herself into the frozen earth of Alaska while every man in the settlement said she was building a coffin, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The first test came in November. A storm moved through the valley on the 12th. Not a major blizzard, but a serious blow. Winds of 35 miles per hour. Temperature dropping from 5 above to 20 below in 6 hours. Heavy snow driven horizontally by the wind. The storm lasted 36 hours. In the above-ground cabins, the storm was an ordeal. The wind found every gap in every wall. Cravath's cabin, which he had built with the confidence of an engineer, had walls of 10-inch spruce logs chinked with moss and clay. But the green logs had already shrunk a 1/4 inch from their September dimensions, opening cracks along the chinking that the wind exploited mercilessly. The interior temperature, despite a roaring fire that consumed 40 pounds of wood in 12 hours, dropped to 45 degrees. Comfortable for survival, but miserable for living. The wind chill made the walls cold to the touch, even on the interior surface. The windows, single-paned, were coated with a 1/4 inch of frost on the inside. Cravath burned through a week's worth of firewood in 36 hours and spent 6 hours after the storm re-chinking his walls with fresh moss and mud that would crack and fall out again in the next freeze-thaw cycle. Lucille Pardlow's store and living quarters, a frame building with board walls and tar paper, fared worse. The wind tore a section of tar paper from the north wall, exposing the bare boards to the full force of the storm. Snow drove through the gaps between the boards and accumulated on the floor inside the north wall, in a drift 6 inches deep. The interior temperature dropped to 32 degrees, despite continuous firing of both the store stove and the living quarters stove. Lucille and her husband Hesketh spent the storm huddled in blankets near the stove, feeding wood into the fire every 20 minutes, and emerged after 36 hours to find their store inventory partially damaged by the snow that had penetrated the wall. In Yelena's Zemlyanka, the storm was barely noticeable. The wind, striking the 18 inches of exposed log wall above the earth berm, had almost no surface to push against. The below-grade walls, surrounded by frozen earth, felt no wind at all. The earth absorbed the wind's energy before it could reach the logs. The entrance tunnel, angled downward and away from the prevailing wind, admitted no draft. The cold air settled in the tunnel and stayed there, a 6-foot plug of dense cold air that the wind could not push uphill into the warm interior. The roof, already covered with 6 inches of sod and earth, accumulated an additional 14 inches of snow during the storm, adding R14 of insulation on top of the existing R3 to R4 of the sod layer. The interior temperature during the storm held at 52 degrees with the stove burning at a low rate, approximately 15 pounds of wood per 12 hours, less than half of what Cravath was burning in his above-ground cabin. When Yelena stoked the stove to its normal burning rate, approximately 25 pounds per 12 hours, the temperature rose to 62 degrees and held there steadily, with no fluctuation from wind gusts, because there were no wind gusts reaching the interior. The walls were warm to the touch, not from conducted heat from the stove, but from the stored heat of the surrounding earth, which at 4 feet below grade maintained a temperature of approximately 33 degrees, regardless of the air temperature above. The temperature difference between the earth wall and the interior air was only 29 degrees, 62 minus 33, compared to a difference of 102 degrees, 62 minus negative 40, between the interior and the exterior air in Cravath's cabin. The heat loss through the below-grade walls was approximately 1/3 of the heat loss through Cravath's above-grade walls, because the temperature gradient driving the heat loss was 1/3 as large. The moisture issue that Lucille had predicted did not materialize. The frozen earth walls did not weep. They were permafrost, frozen solid, and frozen soil does not release liquid water. The birch bark membrane on the roof prevented any snowmelt from penetrating the ceiling. The interior air was dry, drier than Yelena would have liked, because the cold earth walls and frozen ground absorbed moisture from the warm interior air through condensation, and Yelena kept a pot of water on the stove to add humidity. The only condensation occurred on the window glass, which was the coldest interior surface, and Yelena managed this by wiping the glass each morning and keeping a cloth on the windowsill to catch the runoff. After the November storm, Cravath came to look at the Zemlyanka. He walked around the outside, noting how the snow had drifted over the roof and against the bermed walls until the structure was nearly invisible. A low mound of snow on the hillside, with only the stovepipe and the tops of the 2 south-facing windows protruding. He entered through the tunnel, ducking his head and descending the slight slope, and emerged into the interior. He stood there for a moment, saying nothing. The air was warm, the walls were solid, the floor was dry. The stove was burning quietly at a low rate, consuming perhaps 1.5 pounds of wood per hour. He pressed his hand against the log wall above the earth line and felt coolness. The wall was approximately 40 degrees, cooler than the 60-degree air, but vastly warmer than the exterior. He pressed his hand against the log wall below the earth line and felt the same coolness. The earth was holding the wall at a nearly constant temperature, regardless of what was happening outside. Cravath did not apologize for calling it a grave. he asked 3 questions. First, how much wood had she burned during the storm? Yelena told him, approximately 30 pounds per day, 210 pounds over the 7 days of cold weather surrounding the storm. Cravath had burned approximately 560 pounds in the same period, nearly 3 times as much in a cabin with less floor space. Second, had the walls or roof shown any distress during the storm? Yelena showed him the interior. No cracks in the logs, no sagging in the roof, no gaps in the chinking, no sign that the structure had experienced any stress at all. Cravath's cabin had developed 3 new gaps in the chinking, a crack in the ridgepole, and a loosened corner notch that he had shimmed with a wooden wedge. Third, what was the temperature at the coldest point during the storm? Yelena told him, 52 degrees with the stove at low burn, 62 at normal burn. Cravath's cabin had dropped to 45 degrees at normal burn, and he estimated it would have dropped to freezing if the fire had gone out for more than 3 hours. Cravath left without comment. He did not build a Zemlyanka. But he stopped calling it a grave. The real test came on January 14th, 1899. The storm that struck the Yukon Valley that day was not an ordinary blizzard. It was what the indigenous Koyukon people called a tsiek-al, a killing storm, a whiteout that erased the distinction between ground and sky, between solid and air, between the living world and the empty white void that swallowed everything it touched. The temperature, which had been a relatively mild 5 below zero at dawn, dropped to 38 below by noon and continued falling. By midnight, it was 47 below. The wind began at mid-morning, 15 miles per hour from the north, rising to 30 by noon, 40 by late afternoon, and gusting to 65 during the night. The snow was not falling. It was being driven horizontally by the wind, fine dry crystals that moved at 40 miles per hour and that cut exposed skin like powdered glass. Visibility dropped to 0. A man could not see his own outstretched hand. The storm lasted 4 days. By the end of the first day, every above-ground cabin in the settlement was in crisis. The wind had increased to the point where no chimney could maintain proper draft. The gusts created back pressure that reversed the airflow in the stovepipes, forcing smoke into the interiors and choking the fires. 3 cabins had their stovepipes torn off by the wind. The galvanized iron pipe, secured with wire to the roof, was ripped loose by a gust and sent cartwheeling across the snow in the darkness. Without stovepipes, those cabins had no heat. The occupants had 2 choices: rebuild the stovepipe in 65-mile-per-hour wind at 40 below zero, or find shelter elsewhere. Tully Hesketh, Lucille's husband, tried to rebuild his store's stovepipe. He lasted 8 minutes outside before the cold drove him back in. His hands were numb within 2 minutes. His face was frostbitten within 5. He managed to retrieve the stovepipe section from where it had lodged against a tree 30 yards downwind, but he could not hold the wire or the pliers long enough to reattach it. He came back inside with a stovepipe section under his arm and white patches of frostbite on both cheeks, and told Lucille they needed to find somewhere else. By the end of the second day, the structural damage began. The wind had been pushing against the north walls of every cabin for 36 hours. The cabins that were built hastily, with shallow foundations, green logs, and weak corner joints, began to shift. Pardlow's frame store, already damaged in the November storm, lost its entire north wall at approximately 2 in the morning of the second night. The wall did not blow inward. It was pulled outward by the negative pressure on the leeward side as the wind accelerated over the roof, creating a suction force that exceeded the nail-holding power of the frozen lumber. The wall peeled away from the building in a single piece and disappeared into the whiteout. The interior was instantly exposed to the full force of the storm. The temperature inside dropped from 40 degrees to 40 below in minutes. Everything in the store, the food, the tools, the fabric, the medicine, was buried under snow within an hour. 3 other cabins lost roof sections. The sod and pole roofs, heavy with accumulated snow and battered by wind uplift from below, failed at the connections between the roof poles and the wall logs. The wind caught the edge of the sod, peeled it back like a blanket, and the pole deck beneath, no longer weighted down by the sod, lifted and broke apart. 1 cabin lost a quarter of its roof. 2 lost half. The occupants of all 3 retreated to the remaining covered portion of their cabins and huddled in the dark, burning what wood they could reach, waiting for the storm to end or for the walls to go next. If this story has touched you, share it and subscribe, because the quiet engineering that kept families alive and farms running for generations deserves to be remembered. In Yelena's Zemlyanka, the storm registered as sound. The wind howled above the roof, audible through the sod and earth covering, a continuous roar that varied in pitch with the gusts. Snow accumulated on the roof and against the bermed walls, adding insulation with every hour. By the end of the first day, the snow cover on the roof was approximately 3 feet deep, providing R36 of insulation on top of the R4 of the sod layer, for a total roof insulation of R40. The structure was buried. The stovepipe, which protruded 3 feet above the roofline, was the only part of the Zemlyanka visible from outside, a thin column of smoke rising from a mound of snow on the hillside. The interior temperature held at 58 degrees with the stove at normal burn. Yelena could have raised it to 65 by burning more wood, but she was conserving fuel. She had no idea how long the storm would last, and she had learned in Siberia that a storm that starts on a Tuesday might not end until Saturday. She burned 20 pounds of wood per day, a fraction of what the above-ground cabins were consuming when they could keep their fires burning at all. On the evening of the second day, the refugees began arriving. Lucille and Hesketh came first, following the hillside by feel in zero visibility, guided by the thin column of smoke from Yelena's stovepipe. They crawled through the entrance tunnel. Lucille later said it felt like descending into the earth itself, and emerged into the warm, dry interior of the Zemlyanka. Lucille stood in the center of the room and looked at the solid walls and the intact roof and the quietly burning stove and the dry floor and began to cry. She had spent 36 hours in a building with no north wall and falling interior temperatures, and the contrast between that experience and the warm stability of the Zemlyanka overwhelmed her. By the end of the third day, 11 people were sheltered in the Zemlyanka: Yelena, Lucille, and Hesketh, Kravath, and 7 others whose cabins had lost roofs, stovepipes, or walls. 11 people in a 16 by 12-foot room was crowded but survivable. The body heat of 11 adults, approximately 1,000 BTUs per hour combined, supplemented the stove's output and raised the interior temperature to 65 degrees, despite the additional heat loss from the entrance tunnel being opened 11 times as refugees arrived. Yelena organized the space with the efficiency of a woman who had survived Siberian winters in communal Zemlyanka, sleeping in shifts, cooking communally, maintaining the fire on a strict schedule, and, critically, maintaining the entrance tunnel discipline. The tunnel door was opened only when someone needed to enter or exit, and it was closed immediately. The cold air plug in the tunnel was maintained at all times. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. The wind died first, dropping from 40 miles per hour to 15 over the course of 2 hours. And then the snow stopped, and then the clouds thinned, and by noon the sun was visible for the first time in 4 days. The temperature was 31 below zero, which felt warm after 4 days of 45 below. The settlement emerged from the storm to assess the damage. 3 cabins had lost their roofs entirely. 2 had lost walls. 5 had lost stovepipes. Every cabin that was still standing had structural damage. Cracked logs, failed chinking, loosened corner joints, sagging ridgepoles. The Pardlow store was destroyed, the north wall gone, the roof partially collapsed, the inventory buried under snow and ice. Total damage to the settlement's buildings was estimated at approximately $800, a devastating loss for a community where the average annual income was perhaps $400 per person. Yelena's Zemlyanka was intact, not damaged, not stressed, not cracked or shifted or sagged, intact. The snow was scraped from the entrance tunnel. The south-facing windows were cleared. The stovepipe, which had accumulated a cone of wind-packed snow around its base, was brushed clean. The interior was exactly as it had been before the storm: warm, dry, solid, quiet. The walls had not moved. The roof had not deflected. The chinking had not cracked. The structure had experienced 4 days of the most severe storm conditions the Yukon Valley could produce, and it had registered that storm as background noise. The fuel consumption told the story as clearly as the structural assessment. During the 4-day storm, Yelena had burned approximately 80 pounds of wood, 20 pounds per day, to keep 11 people warm in a 16 by 12-foot space. The above-ground cabins that had maintained their fires had burned 40 to 60 pounds per day each to keep 1 or 2 people marginally warm in spaces of comparable size. Yelena's fuel efficiency was approximately 5 to 8 times better per person than the above-ground cabins because the earth walls, the bermed exterior, the snow-covered roof, and the entrance tunnel had reduced the heat loss to a fraction of what the exposed cabins experienced. After the January storm, 3 families in the settlement built Zemlyanka for the following winter. Yelena supervised the construction of all 3, advising on site selection, excavation depth, log wall construction, roof design, and entrance tunnel engineering. The new shelters were built in the summer of 1899, when the ground was partially thawed and easier to excavate, and they were ready for occupancy by October. Cravath was not among the builders. He reinforced his existing cabin instead, adding a second layer of logs to the walls, strengthening the roof with additional rafters, and berming earth against the lower walls in imitation of Yelena's design. The partial berming helped. It reduced the exposed wall surface and provided some wind protection. But it was a compromise, not a Zemlyanka, and Cravath's cabin continued to consume twice the fuel and suffer twice the storm damage of the earth-sheltered structures. By 1903, the settlement had 6 Zemlyanka in addition to Yelena's original. The cost ranged from $80 to $120, depending on size and the availability of labor. The fuel savings were consistent across all of them, approximately 40 to 60% less wood than a comparable above-ground cabin, measured over 5 winters of operation. The structural record was perfect. Zero storm damage across 7 Zemlyanka over 5 winters that included the January 1899 storm and 2 subsequent blizzards of comparable severity. The above-ground cabins in the settlement over the same period accumulated approximately $2,000 in storm damage and required continuous maintenance, re-chinking every fall, re-roofing every 2 to 3 years, and structural reinforcement after every major storm. 2 men suffered frostbite during the storm. One lost the tips of 3 fingers on his right hand. The other lost the outer edge of his left ear. Both injuries occurred while attempting repairs to damaged cabins in whiteout conditions. One trying to reattach a roof section, the other trying to nail a board over a gap where his north wall had separated from the roof. The injuries were preventable. The men went outside because their cabins were failing, and their cabins were failing because they had been built on top of the frozen ground instead of in it. The dogs in the settlement, 7 sled dogs and 3 mongrels that various families kept, survived the storm by burrowing into snowdrifts. The dogs understood what the men did not, that snow was insulation, and that being buried was better than being exposed. A dog curled in a snow burrow, with its own body heat warming the small enclosed space and the snow blocking the wind, was more comfortable than a man in a cabin with no stovepipe. The health benefits were unexpected. The steady temperature inside the Zemlyanka, never below 50 degrees even with the fire out for 8 hours, never above 70 with the fire burning hard, eliminated the cycle of overheating and freezing that plagued the above-ground cabins, where the temperature near the stove might reach 90 degrees while the temperature at the far wall was 35 degrees, and where the temperature crashed to near zero within 4 hours of the fire dying. The stable temperature reduced respiratory illness, reduced the freeze-thaw stress on the body that contributed to joint pain and fatigue, and reduced the fuel anxiety that was a constant psychological burden in the above-ground cabins. The fear that the woodpile would run out before the storm ended. The fear that the fire would die in the night. The fear that the next gust would take the roof. Yelena lived in her Zemlyanka until 1912, when she sold her supply post and returned to Russia. The shelter she had built in 6 weeks in the fall of 1898 was still standing, still solid, still warm, still dry, still invisible under the snow in winter. The logs had not rotted because the frozen earth surrounding them kept them at a temperature below the threshold for fungal growth. The roof had not sagged because the heavy timbers Yelena had specified were more than adequate for the snow load, and the continuous earth covering distributed the weight evenly across the entire roof surface. The entrance tunnel still functioned as an airlock, trapping cold air in its downward slope and keeping the warm interior air from escaping. 14 winters, 1 storm that destroyed half the settlement, 0 damage to the Zemlyanka. The men who called it a grave were wrong. It was the opposite of a grave. It was the only structure in the settlement that the winter could not kill. No myths, no miracles, just earth, timber, snow, and the physics of building down instead of up. The Anfisa question deserves mention. Anfisa was a Koyukon woman who traded at Yelena's supply post and who, when she first saw the Zemlyanka under construction, told Yelena that her people had been building semi-subterranean winter houses in the Yukon Valley for longer than anyone could remember. The Koyukon Nichu, the winter house, was a log-framed structure excavated 3 to 4 feet into the ground with an entrance tunnel, a central fire pit, and an earth and snow-covered roof. The design principles were identical to the Siberian Zemlyanka: earth contact for thermal stability, below-grade construction for wind protection, an entrance tunnel for cold air management, and snow accumulation for additional insulation. Yelena and Anfisa had arrived at the same engineering solution from opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, because the physics of surviving extreme cold in a wind-exposed environment admit only a limited number of correct answers, and building down instead of up is the most correct of all of them. The mathematics of heat loss made the case with precision. Yelena measured the fuel consumption of her Zemlyanka against Cravath's above-ground cabin over the winter of 1899 to 1900, a full 5 months from November through March, encompassing 3 storms and the sustained deep cold of January and February. Yelena burned 2 3/4 cords of spruce over the 5 months, approximately 5,500 pounds of wood, or 37 pounds per day average. Cravath, in a cabin of comparable floor space with no earth berming and single-wall log construction, burned 6.5 cords, 13,000 pounds, or 87 pounds per day. The difference was 4 3/4 cords, 9,500 pounds of wood that Cravath had to cut, split, haul, stack, and burn that Yelena did not. At the local rate of $15 per cord for cut and split firewood, the fuel savings were approximately $71 per winter, a sum that exceeded the annual cash income of most families in the settlement. The labor savings were equally significant. Cutting, splitting, and hauling 6.5 cords of spruce required approximately 325 hours of work, roughly 8 weeks of full-time labor. Cutting 2 3/4 cords required approximately 140 hours, 3.5 weeks. The difference was 4.5 weeks of labor per winter that Yelena could devote to her supply post business instead of her woodpile. Over 14 winters of operation, the cumulative labor savings were approximately 63 weeks, more than a year of full-time work. The Zemlyanka, by reducing fuel consumption by 60%, had given Yelena the equivalent of 1 additional year of productive life over 14 years of residence. The summer performance of the Zemlyanka was an unexpected benefit that the Siberian tradition had not prepared Yelena for. In Siberia, summers were brief and mild, and the Zemlyanka was primarily a winter shelter. In the Yukon Valley, the brief but intense summer, with temperatures reaching the 80s and 90s in July, 18 to 20 hours of daylight, and clouds of mosquitoes that made outdoor work miserable, made the Zemlyanka equally valuable as a summer shelter. The earth surrounding the below-grade walls maintained a temperature of approximately 45 to 50 degrees in midsummer, warmer than the winter ground temperature because the seasonal heat wave had penetrated the upper soil layers. And the thermal mass of the earth kept the interior cool, 60 to 65 degrees, when the above-ground cabins baked in the sun and reached temperatures of 90 degrees or above. Yelena's Zemlyanka was the coolest and most comfortable space in the settlement from June through August, and during the worst of the mosquito season, when the insects drove people indoors and the above-ground cabins became stifling, the cool, dry interior of the Zemlyanka was the only tolerable indoor space in the settlement. Yelena charged nothing for the shade and the comfort, but the traffic through her supply post during the summer months increased her sales considerably. The 7 Zemlyanka that the settlement eventually built were all variations on Yelena's original design, adapted to the specific site conditions and the needs of the individual families. Pardlow's replacement store, built to replace the structure destroyed in the January storm, was the largest, approximately 24 by 16 feet, with a 6-foot excavation that put the entire lower floor below grade with a conventional storefront above ground on the south side for customer access. The hybrid design combined the thermal efficiency and storm resistance of the Zemlyanka with the accessibility and visibility that a commercial establishment required. It survived every subsequent storm without damage and used approximately half the fuel of the previous building. The smallest Zemlyanka in the settlement was a storage cellar that Cravath eventually built. Not a dwelling, but a food storage facility, excavated 6 feet into the ground and covered with logs and earth, maintaining a nearly constant temperature of 34 to 36 degrees year-round. Cravath never built a Zemlyanka for himself to live in. His pride would not permit him to adopt the design of the woman he had called a gravedigger. But he adopted the principle for his provisions, acknowledging through his actions what he would not acknowledge in words, that the earth was a better insulator than any wall he could build above it. Yelena's original Zemlyanka was occupied by successive residents after she left in 1912, and it remained in use as a dwelling and storage facility into the 1920s. 25 years after construction, the basic structure was sound. The below-grade logs, preserved by the constant cold of the surrounding permafrost, showed no rot or insect damage. The above-grade logs, exposed to seasonal freeze-thaw cycles and summer moisture, had deteriorated more. The exterior surface was weathered and soft to a depth of approximately half an inch. But the structural integrity was maintained because the logs were 10 inches in diameter and the weathered zone was superficial. The roof had been resodded once, in 1908, when the original birch bark membrane had deteriorated enough to admit occasional drips during the spring snowmelt, a repair that took 2 days and cost nothing but labor. 14 winters, 4 major storms, 0 structural failures, 2 3/4 cords of fuel per winter instead of 6.5. 11 lives sheltered in the worst blizzard in the settlement's history, and a woman from Krasnoyarsk who understood that the frozen earth of the Yukon was not her enemy, but her ally. The same understanding that the Koyukon people had carried for generations, the same physics that the Siberian builders had encoded in the Zemlyanka tradition, the same truth that the men building their cabins on top of the frozen ground refused to see because building down felt like surrender and building up felt like defiance. And on the frontier, defiance was valued more than survival until the storm came and reminded everyone which one mattered. The ventilation question, the concern that Cravath had raised about suffocation from stove fumes in an underground space, deserves a technical answer. Every combustion stove consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and smoke. In an airtight underground space, a burning stove would deplete the available oxygen within hours, and the occupants would die from carbon monoxide poisoning before they died from cold. Yelena knew this. Every Zemlyanka builder in Siberia knew this. The solution was not complex, but it was essential. 2 ventilation channels, one low and one high. The low channel was a 4-inch diameter hole through the wall at floor level on the windward side of the structure, covered with a sliding wooden panel that could be opened or closed to control airflow. The low channel admitted fresh cold air at floor level, where it remained being denser than the warm air above it, and the fresh air was drawn across the floor to the stove, where it entered the firebox through the stove's own air intake and fed the combustion. The high channel was a similar 4-inch hole through the wall at ceiling level on the leeward side, which exhausted stale warm air from the top of the room. The 2 channels created a slow, continuous circulation, fresh air entering low on one side, rising as it warmed, crossing the room at ceiling level and exiting on the other side. That provided adequate ventilation without creating a perceptible draft or significant heat loss. The ventilation rate was approximately 5 cubic feet per minute, enough to maintain safe oxygen levels and exhaust combustion gases for a single stove and up to 6 occupants. During the January storm, with 11 people in the Zemlyanka, Yelena opened the low ventilation channel fully and cracked the entrance tunnel door 6 inches to increase the fresh air supply. The additional ventilation increased heat loss slightly, perhaps 5%, but maintained safe air quality for the 11 occupants over the 4-day duration of the storm. Kravath, who was one of the 11, noticed the ventilation channels on the second day and examined them with professional interest. He acknowledged to Yelena that the low-high ventilation system was well designed, a rare compliment from a man who had spent 2 months publicly criticizing her construction. The drainage system was equally deliberate. The pit floor was graded with a slight slope, approximately 1 inch per foot, toward a sump in one corner, a small hole approximately 12 inches deep and 12 inches across, lined with gravel. Any water that entered the Zemlyanka, from snowmelt tracked in on boots, from cooking spills, from condensation dripping from the windows, flowed by gravity to the sump and was absorbed into the gravel below. During the spring thaw, when the permafrost surface briefly softened and moisture accumulated on the earth walls, the sump collected the runoff and Yelena bailed it with a tin cup once or twice a day. The total moisture management was minimal, perhaps a gallon of water per day during the 2-week thaw period in May, and virtually nothing during the frozen months from October through April. The psychological dimension was real, and Yelena did not dismiss it. Living below ground affected people differently. Some of the refugees during the January storm found the Zemlyanka comforting. The earth walls felt solid and protective. The silence was calming after the howling wind above, and the steady warmth was deeply reassuring after hours of cold and fear in their damaged cabins. Others found it oppressive. The low ceiling, the small windows, the earthen smell, and the knowledge of being surrounded by frozen ground on 5 of 6 sides created a sense of confinement that bordered on panic for one man who had to be talked through the first night by Lucille, who sat beside him and spoke calmly until he fell asleep. Yelena had experienced this reaction before in Siberia, and she understood that the Zemlyanka was not for everyone. Some people needed to see the sky. Some people needed tall walls and bright windows and the feeling of height and openness that an above-ground cabin provided. These people would always choose the above-ground cabin, even knowing it was colder, more expensive to heat, and vulnerable to storms, because the psychological cost of living underground was higher than the physical cost of living above it. But for those who could adapt, and most people could, within a week or two, the Zemlyanka provided something that no above-ground cabin on the Alaskan frontier could match: certainty. The certainty that the walls would hold. The certainty that the roof would not come off. The certainty that the fire could be small and the room would stay warm. The certainty that the worst storm the Yukon Valley could produce was, inside the Zemlyanka, nothing more than a sound above the ceiling and a few extra inches of insulating snow on the roof. In a world where certainty was the rarest and most valuable commodity, where a storm could destroy a year's work in 4 days, where a stovepipe failure could mean death, where the difference between survival and disaster was measured in cord feet of firewood and inches of wall thickness. The Zemlyanka offered something that no amount of money could buy above ground: